On December 17, 2010, a humiliated fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi struck a single match in a rural Tunisian town. That localized act of self-immolation swept across the Middle East and North Africa, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of citizens into the streets from Tunis to Cairo. The region had seen decades of protests, crackdowns, and localized outrage, yet those earlier movements had always been contained by state security. This time, the fire consumed governments that had held absolute power for generations. The speed and scale of this regional contagion pointed to a much larger set of demographic and economic forces that had been building beneath the surface for years. This demographic pyramid of the Arab world reveals a massive surge in the youth bracket. Decades of high birth rates and longer lifespans created a generation of highly educated young people. But they entered an economy with no jobs, leaving millions trapped in a state of pre-adulthood, unable to afford homes, start careers, or get married. While internal pressure built, an external shock arrived from miles away. In late 2010, a severe drought stalled over China's agricultural regions. Crop failures halved the country's wheat supply. To compensate, China bought up international reserves, doubling the price of global wheat in months. This text outlines exactly how that distant weather event collided with the Middle East. In countries like Egypt, citizens were already spending nearly 40% of their income on food. Bread provides 1/3 of their daily caloric intake, meaning the global price shock directly threatened their physical survival. For a generation facing both economic exclusion and the sudden loss of basic food security, the preservation of the existing political order became incompatible with their own survival. In Tunisia, the epicenter of the protests, citizens faced an autocratic regime that had controlled the state for over 2 decades. Zine El Abidine Ben Ali maintained power through a pervasive police state and strict political repression. Spontaneous protests lacked the structure needed to govern, but Tunisia had the UGTT, the nation's largest labor union. Founded during the anti-colonial struggle, it possessed hundreds of thousands of members and deep organizational roots across every sector of the economy. The UGTT stepped in to harness the chaotic street energy. On January 14, 2011, they orchestrated a massive general strike in the capital. Hundreds of thousands marched down Avenue Bourguiba, paralyzing the government's ability to function and forcing Ben Ali to flee the country. The presence of this pre-existing civic institution provided the necessary discipline to negotiate a transition of power and keep the state from collapsing into anarchy. Bahrain's protests centralized around a powerful cultural symbol, the Pearl Monument in Manama. Here, the disenfranchised Shia majority demanded political equality from the ruling monarchy. 20-year-old poet Ayat al-Khormezi read verses of resistance to the crowds gathered at the roundabout. Shortly after her public performance, she disappeared, detained by state security, and subjected to a military tribunal. Backed by foreign Gulf Coast forces, the Bahraini government cleared the protesters with overwhelming physical force. They then brought in construction equipment and razed the Pearl Monument to the ground, deliberately erasing the physical infrastructure of the dissent. Without a powerful domestic institution to shield the demonstrators, raw civilian defiance was easily crushed, leaving the uprising to survive only as an oral history among the population. In Syria, the state's response to civilian unrest relied on a template of brute force. When 15 teenage boys painted anti-government graffiti on a school wall in Dera, security forces arrested and tortured them. The resulting demonstrations were met by the military firing on unarmed citizens. This document shows how a record-setting drought had already eroded the social contract in Syria. Between 2002 and 2008, the country's total water resources were cut in half, destroying agricultural livelihoods and forcing desperate farmers to migrate into overflowing, restive cities. As the civilian rebellion gained momentum, Bashar al-Assad deliberately released hundreds of militant extremists from state prisons. The tactic was designed to poison the opposition, forcing the public and the international community to choose between his secular autocracy and a violent jihadist alternative. The strategy fractured the country. Foreign powers, including Iran, Russia, Turkey, and the United States, poured weapons and resources into competing factions, transforming a domestic rebellion into a multi-front geopolitical proxy war. The government deployed sieges, aerial bombardments, and chemical weapons against its own cities. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and nearly 14 million people, more than half the country's pre-war population, were displaced from their homes. When a state employs total destruction rather than negotiate political reform, it creates a vacuum that consumes the stability of the entire region. After 13 years of grinding conflict, a rapid rebel offensive in late 2024 seized major regime-controlled cities in a matter of days. Assad fled to Moscow, ending a 4-decade dynastic rule. Across the Middle East and North Africa, the paths have sharply diverged. Tunisia navigated toward a fragile democracy. Bahrain's monarchy entrenched its absolute rule, and Syria remains a deeply fractured, traumatized landscape. Ousting a political figurehead addresses the immediate target of public anger, but it does not build a functional economy. It does not instantly create jobs for an oversized generation of youth, nor does it reverse the climate-driven resource scarcity that originally hollowed out the agricultural sector. The uprisings were a warning. Replacing a government cannot fix deep structural rot. As long as populations remain trapped by demographic dead ends and failing ecosystems, the underlying conditions for revolt remain fully intact.